Hello everyone, welcome to Crafty Soup. My name is Misty. Today I have for you 10 techniques for using ink pads in your scrapbooking, card making, and other paper crafting world. After I go through the techniques, I will show you a scrapbook layout I made using these techniques, as well as a very quick recap of everything we covered. So let's go ahead and get started. Today I'm using Concord and 9th ink pads in the cube size, but just about any ink pad size should work for these techniques. I will make any notes of what won't when we get to that point. And these are also dye-based inks. Pigment ink pads will work for many of these techniques, but not for all of them, and I will note that as well when we get there. And I am just working on regular cardstock that I've cut down to 3x4 rectangles for demonstration purposes. Let's get started with the first thing here, which I'm calling Technique 0, since this is what most people think of when they think of using ink pads. Now, most card makers will be familiar with ink pads used for stamping, and that's what we're going to talk about here. Really, this part is kind of focused on scrapbookers or other paper crafters who aren't as familiar with inks and stamping, and then most of the other techniques will be more relevant to everybody. I'm going to cover 4 quick stamping techniques that gave me that aha feeling when I learned them many years ago, and so they might be relevant to some of my viewers. First up is stamp masking. With stamping, you tap your stamp in ink and then you stamp it down on the paper. With stamp masking, what you're going to do first is cover up a portion of your stamp, either with some tape, a post-it note, something along those lines, and then you ink your stamp, and when you remove that tape or post-it note, you have parts of your stamp that can now be inked in different colors. With stamping, you don't have to stamp just one image. A lot of stamp sets these days are set up to coordinate, and you can use them to create various scenes. So you can stamp either on these small cards and make your own little journal cards or title cards, but you can also stretch this idea into larger projects. And there's a quick look of what I'm going to use as a title card later. Next up, we have two-step stamping, and now this requires special stamps that have 2 parts that go with the stamping. And this one is kind of the simplest of the two-step stamps, where the parts kind of interlock. A lot of two-step stampings will actually overlap each other. Don't forget that repeat stamping is a technique that you can do. You stamp the same image, here I'm using a word, over and over again to add impact to your projects. Now that we covered what ink pads are intended for in stamping, let's go ahead and start with some simple techniques and work our way up to more complicated techniques. First up here is inking your edges, and I want to remind you that you can ink your edges in any colors you want. This was very popular to do in browns and blacks back in the day, but here I'm inking my edge with navy blue. Next up, I'm going to ink my edges in more than one color. Have you ever considered doing rainbow edge inking? That's exactly what I'm doing here, and this is one of those cases where the ink cubes are going to be more helpful than a full-size ink pad, but you can make it work if you don't have ink cube sizes. And take a look at those final results. Okay, for technique 2, we're going to start with some direct-to-paper techniques where we use our ink pad straight onto paper. And I'm going to use my ink pad to streak it across my paper to create stripes. Now you can see here, depending on how juicy your ink pads are, how much pressure you use, and the angle that you tip your ink pad, you can get different results. If you want a straighter result, you can ink along the edge of a ruler. Just make sure your ruler is washable and that it's not too thick, that it won't allow your ink pad to touch the surface of your paper. But I've just played with various pressures of my ink to get to these results in these stripes. And of course you can go larger, but you can also go smaller. So here I'm just inking a portion of this piece of paper to get some more organic stripes on this project for a more dynamic look and a more artsy look. So here's what that looks like. And then we'll take a look at both of those stripes side by side. So that is direct-to-paper stripes. So we're going to do printing next, and this is another direct-to-paper ink technique. The last technique, as well as this technique, can be used with any size ink pad, depending on the size of your paper. So when I talk about printing, I'm talking about just pressing your ink pad directly onto your paper, and most ink pads are squares or rectangles, so you'll get shapes and patterns in those varieties. However, there are some ink pads on the market that I can think of, like Catherine Pooler, who have oval ink pads, so that would create even a different look. And here I'm creating just a checked style pattern using these ink pads, and I'm overlapping them a little bit for more of an artsy feel. But remember, you can also leave spaces in between your stamping, quote unquote, with these ink pads, and you can get more of a grid-like look. And right here I have for you a super quick tip. If your ink pads seem dry, they could be out of ink, or they could just be dry. And this product by Ranger is called Ink Refresher, and all you have to do is spritz a couple of sprays onto your ink pad, and that refreshes it, and it will allow that ink to transfer better. I will put a link to that product in the show description in case you need to get some of that. And I wanted to remind you that you don't have to use your ink pads in a standard orientation. You can rotate them and get other shapes. So here I'm creating a diamond pattern, so you can get more of an argyle print. And here's a look at just one of those options before we move on. And when I said rotating your stamp, this number 4 deserves its own technique point, because if you put your stamp pad directly on your paper and then rotate it, you're going to end up with circles. Thanks, geometry. So this is a fun way to get more use out of your ink pads, and this is going to work no matter what shape your ink pad is. Even if you have an oval ink pad, if you rotate it, you'll get a complete circle. So I think this one is really fun, and it's great for making large backgrounds if you have full-size ink pads. And there is a final peek at that one before we move on. Technique number 5 is watercoloring. This is one technique that won't work with pigment ink pads. Now, I've shown watercoloring many times on my channel because it is something I really enjoy, but if watercoloring makes you nervous, start small. And here I have that stamped image that I started off the video with, and I am just putting a dab of ink onto a plastic surface, picking it up with a wet paintbrush, and then just gently adding it to my project. Here I'm making those light bulbs glow. And if we keep moving with watercoloring, we can get our ink set up and then just paint random color swatches onto our patterns. Now, this technique, when you add water to ink, will reduce the vibrancy of your colors, so make sure that you do a test to know what your colors are going to look like before you do a whole project this way. Because I'm working on regular cardstock, that ink will soak pretty quickly into the paper and be a little bit splotchy. So this is the one that I like best for regular cardstock, and that is ink smushing, or the packaging technique, where you put your ink, your water on the plastic, and then you take that plastic directly to touching your paper, and that creates more organic shapes and flows to these. And here you can see style A on the left was the direct paintbrush, and the style on the right, letter B, was the ink smushing. We are up to technique 6, and that is splatters. A lot of people will do splatters with spray mist bottles, but you can use the same product and not have to buy any new products to get this look. So I am putting that onto a block, a plastic block, which I use for stamping, and then I am just taking a paintbrush and kind of flicking it off the edge of the block. And remember, you can do this in whatever color you want, as many colors as you want, and you can get these really artful backgrounds. Technique 7, we're going to talk about blending. That is a super hot thing in the paper crafting world right now, and I am using these blending foams to do my ink blending. However, there are makeup style blending brushes on the market that are super hot and popular right now. Either one will work. It's just personal preference. I find that the foam blenders give a more vibrant blended look, and the blending brushes can give a softer look unless you work longer to get deeper shades. And if you want to avoid inky fingers, you can use a post-it note as a little finger protector and stick the post-it note to your fingers, and then use that to hold down your paper as you're working. And there's a look at the vibrancy of the colors that I got from these foam blending tools. Next up, we're going to talk about stenciling. This is an age-old technique, so you probably know about stenciling already, but let me show you it just in case you don't. And when you stencil, you can stencil on top of your plain paper on the left there, or you can go ahead and stencil on top of already inked up papers, and that just gives you more layers, more texture, and a more dynamic project. So don't forget about layering these techniques with each other. Now there are lots of different shapes and sizes of stencils, as well as different tools that you can use to ink through your stencil. I prefer the blending foam tools, and I matched the size of my stencil to my project. And there's the close-up of it on plain paper, as well as over a pre-inked background. Moving on to number 9, this is related. It's called ink lifting. Now you can do ink lifting in other ways, but I am going to use my stencils here. So I sprayed a paper towel with just water, pressed it onto my inked background through the stencil, and then lifted it up. That is going to be a more subtle ink lifting technique. With this one here, I am wetting a paper towel and then really kind of rubbing into the creases of that stencil, and that will be a medium level technique. Here I'm using a foam blending tool and I'm dipping it into water, not so that it's soggy or drippy, just so that it's nice and moist, and that will give you a much more bold pattern. Quick tip, that foam will collect ink on it as you work, and if you move between colors, it can transfer ink and muddy up your colors, so I just wipe it clean every so often onto a rag to keep my colors clear. So this technique can also be called ink ghosting, and you can see the different results you can get here. I really should say that your mileage may vary depending on your ink brand and your paper, because those really can make a difference. And our final technique for today is dyeing. These are dye-based inks after all, and they are going to dye things, including your paper. However, we can dye other things. I'm going to dye lots of fibers here. Now this will work best with cotton fibers. However, that little pom-pom that I have down there, I don't believe that's cotton. I think that one is some kind of polyester product. And you'll see how it comes out in the end. There are 2 different ways that you can do this dyeing. You can directly press the item onto your ink pad, or you can use a puddle of ink and water on a plastic sheet and dip your projects into there. On the left there, I have the directly dyed fibers. And the con of that is that these can bleed off ink in the future, but the pro is you get more vibrant colors. So on the right, I have the dip dyed projects. The pro there is that they shouldn't bleed after they're dried. But the con is you get much softer colors, and that may not be the look you're going for. And you can see the comparison of these projects and these colors, especially here in this last picture. We got through the 10 plus techniques. Let's take a look at how I created a project. I just used those bits and pieces of paper and cut them apart to create small bits of pattern paper to put on this layout. I did add some extra stamping behind some elements. I glued my fibers into shapes to add dynamic look to some of these elements. I also used them to cover up a stamping boo-boo that I made, so that's a nice thing to do with embellishments. I created a little tassel with those fibers, as well as that pom-pom border on my photo to draw more attention there. You can see I've added some more stamping on some of these cards. On the far right there, I've stamped another light bulb over some watercoloring. Now normally I would not put all these techniques together on one layout, but I wanted to show you how fun it can be to use all of these cool patterns and techniques for a bold, fun, poppy project. Before we go, let's do a super quick recap. So we've talked about stamping in various ways, including masking, creating scenes, 2-step stamping, and more. We've inked our edges, both in solid colors and multiple colors. We've created stripes of various techniques. We have created prints of various shapes and sizes and techniques. We've done some watercoloring and some watercolor smushing. We've done some spatters. We've got some lovely ink blended panels that then you can move on to do more with, including stenciling and ink lifting. And we've dyed some fibers for embellishing. So that was 10 plus techniques in under 15 minutes. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching all the way to the end, because the thumbs up and the completion of watching this video both help YouTube's algorithm to share these ideas with more YouTube viewers out there. Thanks so much for joining me, and I will see you next time.